Tanner picked up the mission briefing, walked it across the room, and dropped it in the trash can in front of everyone. Not slid it aside, not set it down, dropped it. The metal can rang out in the silence of the operations tent like something final. Then he turned to the room and said, without looking at her, "I'm not running a babysitting operation." Sergeant Dana Lowe was standing 4 feet away. She had a rifle on her back that she had qualified with at distances that made the base range master go quiet in the particular way people go quiet when the math doesn't fit their expectations. She was 5'2" and had been 5'2" since she was 17, and had spent the years since then learning exactly what that meant in rooms like this one. It meant this. It meant a folder and a trash can and 14 men deciding simultaneously that the same thing was funny. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The transport from Kandahar landed at 0350 and nobody came. Lowe stood on the tarmac with her ruck and her rifle case and watched the aircraft taxi away and left the darkness where it was. She had been told someone would meet her. That was in the orders. Someone from the unit, a vehicle, a map to the forward operating base. That was basic. That was courtesy. That was the minimum. The minimum had not shown up. She adjusted the rifle case on her back, picked up the ruck, and walked toward the lights of the fob alone in the dark. She had been in the Army for 8 years. She had been a markswoman for most of that, had trained in conditions that went well past what the qualification range could simulate, had twice been the top scorer in joint exercises that included American, Canadian, and British shooters. She had also spent 8 years walking into rooms where the same calculation happened the moment she cleared the doorframe. People looked, people measured, people arrived at a conclusion before she opened her mouth, and the conclusion was always the same. She had learned to file it, not forget it. She had also learned that pretending something doesn't cut you is not the same as it not cutting you, but she had learned to put it somewhere it wouldn't interfere with the work. A shelf behind her sternum, somewhere cold and organized. The gate guard at the FOB did the calculation in about 3 seconds. "Sergeant Lowe?" "That's right. You're the sniper attachment." He said it the way a man says something that doesn't quite add up. "That's right." A pause. He handed back her ID. "Operations tent is the second structure on your left, Sergeant. The brief started at 0340. She didn't say anything about the brief having been scheduled for 0430. She filed that too, behind the sternum with everything else, and walked to the operations tent. The tent went quiet when she came in, the particular quiet of a group of people who have just reached a unanimous silent conclusion. There were 14 men, a mix of Army Rangers and JTF-2 operators on joint deployment, plus a defense intelligence liaison in civilian clothes at the back of the room. All of them had the same expression, the expression that said there has been a mistake. Major Graham Tanner was standing at the front beside a topographic map of the valley system they'd been briefed on before departure. He was 6'1" and built the way men are built, who have spent 20 years treating their body like a piece of mission-critical equipment. He had a jaw that suggested he had never once in his life second-guessed anything, and eyes that seemed constitutionally incapable of adjusting their assessment of a situation once that assessment had been made. He looked at Lowe the way a mechanic looks at a car that has arrived at the wrong garage. "You're late," he said. The brief moved up. "I wasn't notified. The brief moved up because the window is tightening." He said it with the ease of a man who had not for a single moment considered that this was information she might have needed. "Find a seat." She found one. Someone behind her said something low and private, loud enough that the private part was a performance. To her left, a man she would later identify as Warrant Officer Graves said, without raising his voice, "She looks like she's held Girl Scout cookies." The laughter was easy, the comfortable laughter of men in a room where there are no consequences. Lowe opened her mission folder and began to read. The objective was a remote relay station in the Upper Valley, compromised 2 days prior. Intel suggested a cell of 6 to 8 fighters had moved into the surrounding ridgeline to interdict resupply routes. The mission was to clear the approach route, establish a security perimeter, and extract the station's technical team. Tanner's selected route ran through a narrow flat between 2 ridge systems, a 2-kilometer exposure with high ground on both sides. Lowe read the topographic overlay 3 times. She raised her hand. Tanner looked at her the way professors look at students who are interrupting a lecture to ask about something that will not be on the exam. "The route," she said. "The flat between the ridges. The eastern ridge has a series of natural shelf formations at approximately 40-meter elevation intervals. From any one of them, you'd have overlapping coverage of the entire 2-kilometer exposure. If there's any elevated hostile element, We have current aerial imagery of the route. From when? Tanner paused. 60 hours ago. The wind pattern in this region over the last 24 hours. Sergeant. He said it slowly, with the careful enunciation of a man explaining something to someone he has already decided cannot understand it. This unit has run 41 combat operations in 6 countries. I appreciate that you've had time to look at the map. When I need input on route selection, I'll ask for it. The tent was very quiet. Graves, to her left, leaned back slightly. The expression on his face was almost the look of a person who feels a small private pang about what is happening, but not quite enough of one to say anything about it. Copy that, sir, Lowe said. She went back to reading. Her thumb stayed on the topographic overlay. She kept looking at the eastern ridge. At the end of the brief, Tanner read out the formation. Point element, assault team, intelligence liaison, rear security. He read them in order, with names and roles, with the crisp efficiency of a man who had done this many times. He did not name Lowe until the last line. You'll be attached behind the main element. She knew what that meant. They all knew what that meant. She saw it in the way 3 men shifted in their chairs. Sir, she said, my operational function is long-range precision overwatch. That function is most effective if I can establish elevated positioning ahead of the main element before they enter any contested terrain. Behind the formation puts you where I need you, Tanner said, which is not somewhere you slow us down. The sentence settled in the tent like something heavy dropped from a height. Graves made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Lowe counted 3 seconds. Copy that, sir, she said and folded her folder. Outside between the operations tent and the vehicle line, she did what she had learned to do. She stopped. She breathed. She took everything that had happened in that tent, and she moved it carefully to the shelf behind her sternum. Not away. She had never been able to put it actually away, but somewhere it would not interfere with what she needed to do next. She went to draw equipment. The quartermaster was 23 and spent approximately 4 seconds staring at her load requirements before recovering himself. The full TAC 50 setup, he said. Yes, that's over 60 kilograms of kit, Sergeant. I know what it weighs, she said pleasantly. I've been carrying it for 4 years. He got her the gear. She spent the next 90 minutes alone in the equipment bay doing what she always did before an operation. She built her loadout with the economy of someone who has spent years calculating the exact weight a human body can carry over exact distances at exact pace and still be capable of precision work at the end. Every ounce was a decision. Every item either essential or absent. She thought about the ridge while she worked. There was a peak on the eastern edge of the topographic overlay. She had seen it during the brief. High ground, technically outside the operational footprint, marked only by elevation 2,800 meters above the valley floor. From its upper approaches, she calculated a shooter with the right equipment could reach anything in the flat below. Every point of the exposed route, every shelf on the eastern ridge where a hostile element might be waiting, nobody had mentioned it. It wasn't on the route. She thought about it for a long time. Then she went to find Graves. She found him at the vehicle line running through comms checks with 2 others she had been introduced to as Deschamps and Park. Deschamps was quiet, methodical, with the focused efficiency of someone who had done very dangerous things for a long time. Park was red-haired and talked in the way of a man whose voice tended to arrive somewhere slightly before he did. Graves, she said. He looked up. Sergeant, 5 minutes. Something shifted in his face. He held up a hand to Deschamps and Park, and they moved off with the practiced discretion of people who recognize when a conversation was not for them. Graves leaned against the vehicle and crossed his arms. Go ahead. The eastern ridge, she said. You've looked at the topo. I've looked at the topo. And it's the route the major selected. That's not what I asked. His jaw moved slightly, the movement of a man deciding something. The shelf formations are a problem if anything is up there, he said finally. 2 kilometers of exposure with no lateral exits. If you're in contact in that flat, you have one direction of movement, and whoever is behind you already knows that direction. Graves was quiet. I know, Lowe said. I know you know. I need to understand why nobody is saying it. He looked at her for a moment. In that moment, she thought she saw something that might have been respect, or might only have been recognition, the acknowledgement that passes between 2 professionals when one of them has done the actual work. Then it was gone. Because Tanner has called it, Graves said, and Tanner has 41 operations and an intel package that says the route is clear. 60-hour-old intel. 60-hour-old intel, he agreed, without agreeing. It was. If something goes wrong on that flat, Lowe said, there's one position that covers the entire eastern ridge and every shelf on it, the peak on the eastern margin. From the upper approaches, a precision shooter can reach every point in that valley. Graves's eyes moved just briefly to the darkness outside the wire where the mountain range was a black shape against a slightly less black sky. That's a serious climb, he said. Especially with your kid, I know. In the dark, I know. The major already told you your position. I know that too. A silence. Longer this time. Lowe, Graves said finally, and something in the way he said her name had changed, not warm exactly, but real. I'm not your chain of command. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'll tell you this. He pushed off the vehicle. Whatever you decide, you better be right. Because if you're wrong, your career ends tonight. And if you're right, he shook his head slightly, you just better be right. He walked back to Deschampson Park. Lowe stood at the vehicle line alone. The wind off the mountain smelled like cold rock and diesel. She thought about a woman named Sergeant Patricia Lowe, her mother, not her, who had served 2 tours and come home and told her daughter that the hardest thing in the military was not the physical part. The hardest thing was walking into rooms where every person in them had already decided the outcome and finding a way to remain present enough to do the work anyway. She thought about the flat between the ridges. She thought about 14 men walking 2 kilometers of exposure while she followed behind them like inventory. She thought about the peak. She went to stage for departure. At 07:20, the convoy formed up at the southern gate. The tanner moved down the line, doing final checks with the particular brisk efficiency of a man who had never once in his professional life experienced a situation that his plan had not anticipated. When he reached Lowe, he stopped and looked at her ruck, looked at the rifle case, looked at her. You going to be able to keep pace, he said. Not a question. Yes, sir. Don't slow my element down. Flat, factual. The statement of a thing he considered essentially inevitable. I won't, sir. Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, that she hadn't flinched, then it was gone. Move out, he said. The convoy rolled south. 3 kilometers from the wire, Lowe looked east. The mountain range was emerging from the pre-dawn dark, ridge by ridge. She found the peak unmistakable from the topo, a steep mass of granite and shale that looked as though it had been driven upward by something underneath that had run out of patience. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at the flat ahead where the convoy would dismount and the element would begin its 2-kilometer approach through the exposure. Then she looked at the mountain again. Tanner had said, behind the main element, Tanner had said, don't slow us down. Tanner had said it with the authority of a man who had never once been wrong for long enough to know what being wrong felt like. Lowe had followed orders for 8 years. She had followed them when they were wrong, when they were demeaning, when they were designed to demonstrate that she was in the wrong room. She had followed them because she believed in discipline, because she believed that what made units survive was the discipline that held when individual judgment and institutional authority came into conflict. But she also believed in 14 men. And she believed in the mountain. And she believed in 62 kilograms of kit on her back and 4 years of carrying it. And the woman who had told her the hardest thing in the military was staying present in rooms that had already decided. The convoy stopped at the dismount point. The element filed off the vehicles. Lowe dismounted. She stood at the edge of the flat and looked south toward the route and east toward the mountain. She made her decision. It was not dramatic. The doubt was real. The full specific weight of what disobeying a standing order in a combat environment meant, the knowledge that if she was wrong, she would lose everything 8 years had built. She felt all of it. She acknowledged it the way she acknowledged pain, as information, and she put it on the shelf. She turned east. And Sergeant Dana Lowe, the woman Graves had said looked like she was selling Girl Scout cookies, walked toward the mountain alone, with 62 kilograms on her back and a wind that was beginning to change direction in the particular way her mother had taught her, meant something large was moving in the atmosphere. She didn't look back. She started climbing. The first section was manageable. Dark rock, cold in her hands, the rifle case pulling her weight backward the way it always did. And she had long since stopped fighting the physics of it and learned instead to compensate, to find a different geometry of balance that used her body's position rather than her body's strength. At 19 minutes, she felt the wind shift. She stopped. She stood on the rock face with her face turned into it, reading it. She had grown up in northern Alberta. She knew what an oncoming weather system felt like in the air before it announced itself visibly. The wind was doing something restless and searching, probing the terrain like something that had not yet made up its mind. A storm, not immediately, but the meteorological data she had reviewed before departure had flagged a high-pressure system pushing southeast. Nobody in the brief had mentioned it. She had mentioned it once, in the pre-mission planning session, and the intelligence liaison had noted it and moved on. She had approximately 90 minutes before visibility across the valley degraded to near zero. She started climbing faster. The pain in her shoulders arrived at 40 minutes, crossing from discomfort into something specific and persistent. The TAC 50 K-straps had been working the same 2 points on her trapezius muscles since the vehicle line, and now those 2 points had opinions about it that they were expressing in some detail. She acknowledged them and kept moving. "You're not tired," she said aloud quietly, the way she had learned to do on long approaches. "You're working." At 51 minutes, she found the chimney. A vertical crack in the rock, maybe 40 centimeters wide, running straight up for what looked like 15 meters. Chimney technique under normal conditions with a day pack was strenuous but straightforward. With a TAC 50 case on her back, it was going to be something else. She looked at it. She looked up at the summit, invisible above. She thought about the flat. She got into the chimney. The case made it close to impossible, else she couldn't get her back flat against the wall. The case sat between her spine and the rock and turned a technique into an improvisation. She angled one shoulder hard into the stone, worked up in 6-inch increments, used muscle groups that chimney technique was not designed to use, and loaded her spine at angles that were going to require a conversation with a physiotherapist at some future point she was not going to allow herself to think about right now. Halfway up, her left arm began to shake, not the managed shake of heavy exertion, the deep, involuntary tremor of a muscle approaching its actual limit. She registered it, assessed it, not failure, boundary. As she shifted the load to her right arm, gave the left a partial rest without stopping her movement upward, and came out of the chimney at 63 minutes onto a ledge where she lay with her face on the rock and both arms shaking and her breathing doing things she couldn't quite call rhythmic. 47 minutes to the summit if she moved well. She got up. The upper face was shorter, but the wind was serious now. No longer probing, committed, coming hard out of the northwest, carrying the fine particular bite of high-altitude desert air. She kept her head down and climbed by feel as much as sight, hands reading the rock ahead of her, feet finding purchase without her eyes to confirm it. At 78 minutes, 11 minutes behind where she had needed to be, she pulled herself over the lip of the summit and onto the upper platform. She dropped the ruck. She unstrapped the case. She opened it with hands that were bleeding from the chimney. She had not noticed during the climb, but she could see it now, the torn skin across her knuckles, the dark smear on the case latches, and she assembled the TAC 50 with the specific muscle memory of someone who had done this 10,000 times in conditions designed to make it difficult. The rifle came together in 4 minutes and 9 seconds. She deployed the bipod, established her position, prone, using a natural rock formation as a windbreak, found her range card and began building her firing solution. The valley floor was visible through her scope, even in the building haze. The flat was visible. The eastern ridge was visible. She could see the element, small, moving, already into the approach. She began scanning the shelf formations on the eastern ridge. She found them on the third shelf. The first was a heat signature that her scope resolved as she held still and waited into a shape that was definitively not rock. A man lying prone with a weapon system she could not fully identify at this distance, but whose profile she recognized without needing to identify. She moved the scope, found the second, found the third, partially behind cover, visible only from the angle she had from above, kept scanning with the patience her mother had told her about. The mountain shows you what it's hiding if you're willing to be still long enough. 7, 8. And then the scope picked up the mortar team behind the upper shelf. Her radio crackled. The element frequency, weak at this distance, audible. Tanner's voice, calm, commanding, the voice of a man who was still working from a plan that didn't account for what was waiting for him. She keyed the handset. "Tanner, this is Lowe. I have eyes on hostile positions. Eastern ridge, 8 confirmed, plus a mortar element on the upper shelf. The flat is a kill zone. I say again, do not advance past the fold in the terrain. I say again, static." Then Tanner's voice, hard and sudden. "Lowe, where are you?" "Summit of the eastern peak. I have thermal and optical on 9 hostile positions. They are set. They are waiting. They have the entire flat covered." A pause, the specific pause of a man revising something inside himself. It was. "You abandoned your assigned position," Tanner said, and his voice was very controlled in the way voices are controlled when the thing underneath them is not. "You contravened a standing operational order. You are going to stand down and you are going to." The first explosion crossed the air before it reached her radio. A flat, hard crack from the valley below, followed by the eruption of the element frequency into the particular chaos that has no civilian equivalent, the sound of trained people finding out at very close range that the plan was wrong. "Contact, contact, eastern Deschamps is down. I can't see. Where is it coming from? Get off the flat lateral cover." There is no lateral cover. Lowe had already stopped listening. She was already working. "The mortar team first." Everything else on that ridge was bad, but a mortar dropping rounds into that flat would end the mission, and most of the men in it in under 5 minutes. The team was 980 meters from her position. Close enough, she dialed elevation. Read the wind, gusting from the northwest at 12 to 18 knots with variance. She needed the lull. She controlled her breathing, found the mortar team in the scope. Tube operator first. She waited for the wind to settle. It paused. She fired. The TAC 50 report hit the air like a physical thing, and she was already cycling the bolt before the round arrived at its destination, which it did, and she was already finding the next position before she confirmed the outcome. The element frequency erupted again. That shot didn't come from the ridge. What was that? Where did that come from? Then Graves's voice, distinct from the others, cutting through with a steadiness that Lowe recognized as the voice of a man who had just understood something significant. Lowe, is that you on the peak? She fired. Again. Second position. That's Lowe, Graves said. She's on the peak. She's on the mountain. And his voice, which she had heard that morning doing easy confidence like a man wearing a familiar coat, had something in it now that she had not heard directed at her in 8 years of military service. She moved her position 3 meters, always move after the shot. Low, Graves said on the frequency, and this time there was nothing complicated about what was in his voice. Keep going. She kept going. Below her, the dynamic of the flat was changing. The incoming fire had dropped, not stopped, but fallen off, and she could hear in the radio traffic the framework of professional soldiers beginning to function again rather than survive. Finding cover, orienting weapons, starting to think. Tanner's voice, stripped of its earlier architecture. How many can she see? Graves said more than us. A silence, not long. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. The specific silence of a man arriving at a revision he had not anticipated. Then Tanner said something quietly, something that almost didn't make it through the static. Can she hold the upper shelf? Graves said. She's already holding it. The storm arrived without announcing itself. One moment the wind was serious and building, and the next moment it was absolute. A wall of driven sand and cold that turned the world in her scope from clear to compromised in under 30 seconds. She switched to thermal. The heat signatures of the men on the ridge showed orange against the cooler rock, moving, repositioning, beginning to understand that something was happening to them from above. She had a window, minutes less. She worked. She moved. She fired. She moved again. The rhythm of it was not dramatic. The rhythm of work, of doing the things she had spent 4 years preparing to do in conditions prepared to make it hard, because she had always known that the moment she needed to do it for real would not be easy. Position 5, position 6. She waited on position 6, reading the pattern of his fire, clocking the interval between bursts. When he rose to engage the element below, she was already there. The mortar position had gone silent. The RPG crew on the upper shelf had gone silent. The 3 shooters remained on the eastern ridge. Tanner's voice. Low, our status. 2 wounded, 1 critical. We cannot move. What's your count? 3 remaining on the ridge, working them. A pause. Then Tanner's voice, and it was different. Not the command voice, not the careful authority of a man who had never revised his assessment in 41 operations. Something underneath, something stripped. How fast as I can work? Low, just her name. Just that. There's a technical vehicle on the southern edge of the upper shelf. They've been holding it. It's moving. She found it in the thermal, a truck working along the ridgeline. 1,150 meters from her position, moving slowly, predictable direction. Distance, Tanner asked, 1150. Moving target. The storm is pulling the wind to 20 plus knots with variance. A pause. Then Tanner said something she had not expected. He said it quietly. No performance, no authority. The simplest version of the thing he needed to say. Can you take it? She looked at the thermal image of the truck, the heat of the engine block bright against the rock. Yes, she said. Another pause. Just breath on the open frequency. Then please, Tanner said. She built the solution in her head. 1,150 meters, moving left to right at approximately 12 kilometers per hour. Wind varying between 9 and 23 knots from the northwest. She needed to lead the truck not by calculation but by prediction, not where it was but where it would be when the round arrived, which meant reading a wind that was not consistent and compensating for the wind that was coming rather than the wind that existed. She breathed out. She stilled. The wind peaked and began to drop. She fired. The truck's engine block stopped. Not an explosion. The round punched through, and the result was catastrophic and immediate, and the truck went from moving to stopped in a distance measured in meters, and the fire that followed was visible in her thermal as a bright bloom spreading across the upper shelf. The frequency was silent. Then Graves said very quietly, with something in his voice she could not quite name, did she just kill a truck? And somewhere in the flat below her, lying wounded and holding his team together, Major Graham Tanner said nothing at all. but his breathing was on the open frequency, alive, steady, and no longer sounding like a man who had an answer for everything. She found the 3 remaining positions. The storm was full now, visibility 0 without the thermal, and she was working in heat and light rather than sight. She worked methodically. She had always worked methodically. That was not courage or talent or anything dramatic. That was what 4 years of preparation looked like when the moment finally arrived. The ridge went quiet. She lay on the summit in the storm with the rifle hot in her hands and listened to the element frequency come back to something that sounded like order. Graves coordinating the wounded. Deschamps, who was alive, coordinating lateral security. Tanner giving instructions in the voice of a man who had been through something and was still standing on the other side of it. 9 positions. Done. Then Tanner, over the frequency, not to her but to the element, giving the order to consolidate. Before he clicked off, he said, in the space between one instruction and the next, 4 words, "Find her a way down." Graves was already moving. The descent was worse than the climb. The storm had changed the mountain in every practical sense. The route she had used coming up was inside the storm now, and the shale fields that had been manageable in building wind were actively moving. The desert storm at this elevation was strong enough to turn loose rock into a hazard that moved. And she found an alternate descent on the northeastern face, a gully system she had identified from the topo, and went into it, and found that the topo's estimate of the angle had been optimistic by approximately 15 degrees. She went down faster and was correct. She had done the math. The correct version arrived too late. At 22 minutes, she heard the wall of the gully give way above her, rock that had been working loose since the storm began, finished by the vibration of her passage. She heard it, and she ran the last 8 meters without enough speed to run, threw herself forward onto the desert floor at the base of the mountain, and the leading edge of the collapse caught her across the back of the shoulders and drove her flat. She lay still, did the inventory, fingers, feet, head still attached. She pushed up against the debris and the weight shifted and she got her hands under her and stood. 2 shapes came out of the storm at a dead run. Graves hit her at full speed and caught her by the shoulders, and he turned her face to check her eyes with the practiced assessment of a man with serious first aid training and very recent motivation to use it. "I'm functional," she said. Her voice sounded far away.
You don't look functional. Functional is the same thing right now.
Park was already clearing debris off the rifle case. "Is the system?" "Hard case," Lowe said. "It's fine." She looked at Park. There was a gash over his left ear, dried dark, that he had not stopped to address. "Deschamps," she said. Graves's face changed, just for a moment. "He's stable," Graves said. "Rhea has him. He's going to make it." He paused. Another 20 minutes and the answer was different. He looked at her. "We need to move." They moved. Tanner was on his feet at the emergency RV point at the mouth of the secondary route. He had taken a round through the left side. She could see the compression dressing through his jacket, and was standing anyway with the specific concession to physical reality that said he had been told not to stand and was complying with roughly half of that instruction. His eyes found her the moment she came through. She had expected something professional, the minimum viable acknowledgement that passes between operators when the job is done. She had not expected him to walk toward her directly and stop 2 feet away and look at her, really look at her, the way he had not once in the operations tent or the vehicle line or the 41 operations that had built the certainty that someone like him carried like equipment, and say, "You're hit." She looked down, blood on her left side, different from her hands. She could feel it now that he'd named it, a specific sharp complaint from the rib cage that she had been successfully ignoring for the last 10 minutes. "Rock from the collapse," she said. "I think it's a bruised rib." "That is not a bruised rib," Tanner said. He was looking at the blood pattern with the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years learning what injuries looked like from the outside. "Medic." "Now!" "Sir, I don't need." "Low." His voice stopped her. Not the command voice. Something under it. Something that had not been there that morning in the operations tent. "You're going to let someone look at that." She looked at him. His face, storm dust on everything. His hand pressed to his own wound. His eyes doing something she had not seen them do before. They were paying attention to her. Not to the situation, not to the tactical picture, to her. "Copy that, sir," she said quietly. The medic packed and dressed the wound, taped it, told her she would need stitches back at the fob. She had 2 cracked ribs, not one. The rock had been more persuasive than she had appreciated. Her left arm was still unsteady from the chimney, a nerve fatigue that would pass, the medic said, but that was her body's assessment of what the last 3 hours had required. The helicopter came in through the storm, GPS only, the pilot either very professional or deeply reckless, and nobody in that flat had time to decide which. It touched down for exactly as long as it needed to. Deschamps went in first, then the other wounded, then the rest of the element, one by one. Tanner counting them through the door the way commanders count, because it is the irreducible minimum, the ancient and non-negotiable accounting of who went out and who was coming back. When Lowe reached the door, Tanner was still standing there. He looked at her, then he put his hand out, not a handshake, not the transactional gesture of authority and rank. He put his hand out the way you put your hand out to help someone through a door when you have decided that the person on the other side of it belongs inside. She took his hand. He helped her through. The helicopter lifted. The storm swallowed the mountains, and the element arranged themselves in the aircraft around the wounded the way soldiers arrange themselves, bodies becoming warmth and padding and presence, and Lowe sat with her back against the hull and her rifle case, across her knees and her hands still bleeding through the field dressing, and she felt the adrenaline begin its long retreat from her system, the way it always did after the worst part was over, a tide going out and leaving behind everything it had covered. It looked across the helicopter at Graves. He was watching Deschamps, his big hands loose in his lap, the specific deliberate relaxation of a man who is not relaxed but has learned not to show the alternative. He felt her looking. He turned. He held up 2 fingers, not a peace sign, not a wave. 2 fingers meaning, I see you, meaning 2 of the people who are alive right now are alive because you went up that mountain. She nodded once. He nodded back. In the base hospital, the doctor told her 11 stitches and 2 cracked ribs and concussion protocol, and do not leave this building tonight. Understood, she said. You were at your absolute physical limit up there, he said, packing his kit. Your body is going to send you a bill for this. Looking forward to it, she said. She was looking at the ceiling of the hospital cot and thinking about nothing in particular when the door opened. She expected the doctor. She did not expect Tanner. He pulled the chair to the side of the cot and sat without asking. His left side had a dressing under his shirt. He was moving carefully, the movement of a man complying at approximately 60% with medical advice. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Deschamps is out of surgery, he said. He's going to make it. Graves kept him, but Graves needed 20 minutes to work with. A pause. He got those 20 minutes because the Eastern Ridge stopped firing. She didn't say anything. I need to say something to you, Tanner said, and I need you to let me finish before you respond. Go ahead. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man organizing words in the right order, which she could see was not his natural condition. I was wrong, he said, each sentence separated. In the brief, about the route, about you. A pause. I made a tactical error, I made a command error, and he stopped, started again. A personal error, and how I ran that brief from the moment you walked into it. The hospital was quiet around them. I have been doing this for 20 years, he said. I have never had someone under my command who, he stopped again, a man who did not stop often. She could see that stopping was not in his operational profile. You climbed a near vertical mountain in the dark with 60 kilograms on your back. You built a firing position on a summit that was not in any operational plan. You engaged 9 hostile positions in a storm that grounded our air support. You stopped a mortar team that would have killed 7 of my people in the first 4 minutes, and you did it because you read the terrain correctly in my briefing tent and I told you to sit down. He held her gaze. I almost got my element killed, he said, because I decided what you were before I looked at what you could do. He didn't look away. I'm not going to dress that up. That's what happened. Lowe had been waiting 8 years for something in the neighborhood of this. Not this exact thing, not from this exact man, but something in the general territory of a person in authority looking at her directly and saying, I was wrong about you. She had imagined it would feel like winning. It felt like something quieter, something more like being seen for the first time in a room that had spent a long time deciding she wasn't there. Graham, he said. She blinked. Sir, after today, Graham is fine, he said, with a small gesture that took in the mountain and the flat and the 11 stitches in her side and everything else that had happened between 0350 and now. Dana, she said. Something happened in his face. Not a smile. Tanner's face seemed structurally unequipped for full smiles, but a shift in the same direction. The debrief was at 1800, the same operations tent, the same corkboard. The topographic map now had markings on it in red that had not been there before, 9 red markers on the Eastern Ridge, and a single blue one on the summit peak that someone had placed there deliberately. Every man in the tent was there. The ones who could stand were standing. Deschamps was absent, still in the hospital ward, and 2 men were absent who were going home differently than they had arrived, and their absence was a weight that everyone in that tent felt and that nobody mentioned because there is no way to mention it that is adequate. Tanner ran the debrief as he ran everything. Structured, chronological, no editorializing, the operational sequence as a factual record. When he reached the section covering Lowe's actions, he read from his notes without looking up. The tent was absolutely still. Sergeant Lowe, having assessed the approach route and identified a high probability of hostile elevated positioning on the eastern ridge, made an independent decision to ascend the peak on the eastern margin and establish an overwatch position. He looked up. That decision was made without authorization and in direct contravention of my standing order, placing her behind the main element. A pause. It was also the decision that preserved the mission and kept this element alive. The record will reflect both of those facts. Graves, against the tent wall with his arms crossed, said nothing. He nodded once, slowly, with the quality of a nod that means something specific. When the debrief finished, when the tent was clearing and the last of the men were filing out into the desert evening, the Defense Intelligence Liaison stopped beside her. Sergeant Lowe. Her voice was the careful, professional voice of a person who measured every word before releasing it. What you did today is going to live in a file that very few people will ever read. The kind of file that gets classified and sits in a building in Ottawa. She paused. I want you to know the people who read it are going to understand exactly what it means, even if no one else does. Lowe held her gaze. That's enough, she said. The liaison nodded and left. The mess at 2100 was mostly empty. Lowe took a tray and sat at the end of a table near the wall, the place she always sat. The place she had sat for 8 years in mess halls and ops rooms and briefing tents, near the wall at the end, in the position that required the least negotiation of other people's willingness to make room. She was halfway through her food when the tent door opened. Graves came in first. Then Park, moving carefully, the 14 stitches above his ear, making him hold his head at a slight angle. Then the medic, then 2 of the rangers, then 3 more, then others, until the tent had people in it and they were all walking in the same direction. None of them said anything. There were other tables. The mess had 12 of them, most empty. Graves walked to hers. He pulled the chair directly across from her and sat down. Park sat beside him. The medic sat beside Lowe. The others filled in around the table, not at the ends, not at a careful distance, but there packed together the way people sit when they have decided something rather than been assigned something. No speeches, no announcements, no ceremony. Just men sitting down because they had decided where they belonged and had decided it was here. Lowe looked at her tray. She picked up her fork. She kept eating. Graves poured himself coffee. Park reached across and took a bread roll from the basket in the center with the casual ownership of a man who has decided this is his table. The medic started talking to the ranger beside him about something logistical and ordinary, and somewhere in the conversation the specific mundane ease settled over the table like something that had always been there, like something she had not realized she had been carrying the absence of. Tanner came in last, the way commanders come, and sat 3 chairs down and caught her eye once. She caught his. He looked away first. She looked away too, back to her food, back to the table that was full of people who had voted with their chairs. She thought about the morning, the tarmac with nobody on it, the folder in the trash can, the laughter. She thought about the mountain in the dark, the chimney, the wind, 9 heat signatures in the thermal, and the specific still moment before each shot and the truck that had stopped moving. She thought about her mother telling her the hardest thing in the military was staying present in rooms that had already decided. She was present now, at a full table, in a room that had changed its mind. Park said something to Graves that appeared to be funny, because Graves made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Graves probably got. The medic was still talking logistics. Someone at the far end of the table was arguing about something that had nothing to do with the mountain or the flat or the morning, arguing with the easy irreverence of people who have survived something together and are already in the way of survivors everywhere, beginning the work of turning it into a story they can live inside. Lowe ate her food. She was not behind the formation. She was not inventory, like she was not the woman who looked like she was selling cookies, or the political paperwork, or the mistake, or any of the other things she had been in that tent at 0350. She was at the table, and outside, in the dark desert beyond the wire, the storm had finally ended. The sky was clearing the way the desert sky always clears after a storm, gradually and then completely, until the whole thing was open and full of more light than any one person needed. The mountain stood where it had always stood, patient, still, exactly tall enough. She had always been the right size. She had just needed a mountain to make the math stop mattering.